So now we want to move on to flying triangles. They've been seen all around the world since at least 1974, without a doubt. We've got November 29th, 1989, Belgium was seen. January 5th, 2000, Southern Illinois. Area 51, Groom Lake. They've been seen almost in every country by every possible culture. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. We've got a case over here of a red one with this exhaust port here. We've got a case in Detroit. We've got Belgium cases. So a brief cross-section of these aircraft have been seen all around the world. The primary features of these triangles, they usually have a white light on the corner of each of the triangle. Some of these are between 200 and 300 feet across. This midsection is generally about 20 feet across. And then there's always this interesting structural work on the bottom and probably a red or amber light in the center of the bottom section of the craft. That's kind of the overall view of what we see here. March 31st, 1999, Kirby, a very significant sighting. And if anyone in this room is a skeptic, I just invite you to look at this gentleman's testimony. Colin Saunders, you can Google him. He gave a really nice 20-minute lecture regarding this particular sighting. A very honest gentleman. I totally believe his case. He was with his family driving home at around 9:50 p.m. after dinner when they came across this particular craft. He saw the aft end of it first. It was tilted up at about 15-degree angle of attack on the left-hand side. And then he said the bottom of this craft tipped up, but it tipped up from the back end. And he said, he used the term that it looked like it was submerged underwater. That's how this actually moved underwater. Here's the view of what it looked like from the aft end. He said it was totally silent, and then he said it had these very interesting raised box sections on the top of the craft. The exterior pictorial version of the exterior of the craft looked like a flowing liquid mercury. It was almost alive. And he said that it was his belief that these extruded sections here were part of a docking mechanism with a larger craft. So as this thing flew over, he could see the bottom of it. It also had these raised sections as well. And then as this thing flew over, you can see a forward section right here. It disappeared from view, but then way off into the far horizon, there was a much larger ship that had a red light on one side and a green light on the other side. And he said that this particular aircraft appeared to be trying to dock with that larger craft. So that may be the reason for these interesting raised sections here. This thing was approximately 50 feet across in conjunction with a Cessna 172 that has a 27-foot wingspan. Here's Colin Saunders here. Here's his UFO model. And when I saw that UFO model, I said, wow, I want to have one of those. So I took his technical blueprint, and then in AutoCAD, I put together this schematic drawing here, which is a cardboard stock model. And I've produced this for each and every one of you. So you can have a black and white version of this, so you can build your own UFO at home, which is an actual authenticated case. This is what the model looks like right here. This is what the bottom of it looks like right here. And so I have one for each one of you. Now, November 22nd, 1985, 15 miles northwest of Madison, Wisconsin. Very interesting case because of this interesting tube section on the bottom of this aircraft. But we don't only have the illustration. We've got the eyewitness testimony. It says the underside of the craft resembled, quote, the back of a refrigerator, like a collection of condensation pipes that ran back and forth. So keep that in mind kind of as we proceed here. I asked the question, is that what you would expect to see on the bottom of an alien spacecraft? I mean, really, I thought you aliens were 100 million light years ahead of us, and yet you're flying around in these vehicles that look like the back of a refrigerator? Someone's lying to you, folks. Someone's lying to you. I can assure you that. January 5th, 2000, this was the first mass sighting of triangular aircraft after the year 2000. Seen by at least 4 police officers, seen by a miniature golf owner who said that this craft looked like a 2-story ranch fly right over his golf course. Very well documented case. Another case for skeptics that might be sitting on the fence. Please examine the January 5th, 2000 overflight of southern Illinois by these triangular shaped craft. Some of these had a red and green section in the aft portion. Always these white lights at each of the corners and then an amber or red light below the belly of the craft. Newspaper clipping service picked this up. It was seen over DuPont County, multiple counties within southern Illinois, not too far from St. Louis. May 23rd, 2001, Allen Park, Michigan. This gentleman saw this craft fly over his taxi, actually, blocked out the stars as it flew over. April 3rd through the 5th, 1975, Lumberton, North Carolina. This craft was seen by multiple police officers. It had an interesting cutout notch section in the back end of the triangle, red lights along the leading section here, and then a high-intensity white light that was shining down a beam onto the ground, seen by multiple eyewitnesses. This is the cutaway drawing here and shows you kind of an isometric view. This is the row of the lights on the leading edge of the craft. Again, this cutout section is another motif that we see throughout these different craft. Now, this is a very interesting case that I got from David Marler, who is the premier researcher in triangular UFOs. We don't have a date, but we know the location was Oregon. According to this eyewitness, this particular craft was about 180 feet across, large triangular-shaped craft with these rounded corners in this location here. According to the eyewitness, this particular craft parked itself, hovered about 20 feet above the river, the Little Pudding River in Oregon, and then it started dropping down this 8 to 10 foot diameter metallic tube, went right into the river, started sucking up this water, and then he noticed that right next to this tube, water was coming out too. So the water's going up, water's coming down, and then he said there was a blue beam of light that exited off the left end of the craft. And then he said something very interesting. There was lights pulsating across the circumference here. And then there what looked like these 3 landing gear legs that popped out of the bottom. But these weren't landing gear legs. He called them overflow valves because water was shooting out of these overflow valves. And then there were 3 orange orbs that popped out of the bottom of this thing. About 2 minutes later, after this had completed whatever it was doing, he said it sounded like a washer machine. These orbs merged back into the craft. This craft slowly took off, and then when it reached about an altitude of about 1,000 feet, this thing took off like a spark off a grinding wheel. So that was that particular, almost a USO case. Enormous turbine blade UFO, January 21st, 1997, Puerto Rico, also came from the David Marler files. Basically, a primary eyewitness saw this particular craft hover near his location. Now, if you look at the size, he estimates between 500 and 800 feet across. We're talking a massive ship here. Multicolored lights along the leading portion of the vehicle. Then he said it had this section on the bottom that had these rotating turbine blades. But it was his impression that these turbine blades were rotating far too slow to support this vehicle. So there's no way it could be the primary source of propulsion, according to the eyewitness. He also said that there was a strange being that had a pear-shaped head on a transparent cupola or dome section of this aircraft. 2 minutes after observing this aircraft, a black 4x4 vehicle pulled up right next to him. A security agent got out of that vehicle, started questioning about this particular craft. No sooner did that security agent start interrogating the primary eyewitness, 2 identical craft to this first one popped out of the clouds and started following this original craft. This craft, at that point, started introducing it was kind of like a smoky blue glow around this vehicle, and then this thing took off. The other ones were trying to chase after it, but they couldn't get it. So this is January 1st, 1997. Another case from the David Marler files. I put together an illustration here. August 25th, 1990, Barnsley, England. Primary eyewitness and his wife were returning from a Fleetwood Mac concert at night when, out of nowhere, coming this strange triangular-shaped craft that he estimated between 100 and 200 feet across emerged from a dark, misty cloud directly below the cloud bank. And he said he saw it long enough, 30 seconds, long enough to get some really good details. It had 1 light on each terminating point of the triangle, 1 light on the bottom here that was white. And then he said it had this recessed section on the belly of the craft. And in that recessed section, he could see what looked like cross-beam and girder construction, very structural construction on this bottom point here. And then there was these series of white lit, backlit windows that had these humanoid figures, and it was his impression that this was a man-made vehicle. That's what his impression was, that these were actually man-made vehicles. This particular individual on the right seemed to be either pointing or waving back to the primary eyewitness. Now, North Wales Triangle, sighted over the M56 motorway on June 1st, 1997, flew across the motorway at about 100 miles an hour, startled people on the motorway, and then zipped off at a high rate of speed. That's all the details we have on that particular case. So now we move on to the ever-present, ubiquitous, everyone's favorite triangle, the TR3B. Anything having to do with the TR3B has to be credited to Edgar Fouché. I want to give him credit for Edgar Fouché. Also want to mention that Edgar Fouché has no first-hand knowledge specifically dealing with this aircraft. So he didn't work on this program, but he claims that he knew people at Area 51 who did. I want to make that perfectly clear. Also want to state that I don't want to divert any way, shape, or form or percentage from his original testimony. I want to give you his straight answers to a number of questions that I brought to his attention. This is his response, so I don't want to divert from anything that he had to say. Technical specifications regarding the TR3B. According to Edgar Fouché, there are two different sizes of the TR3B, approximately 250 feet per side for the prototype version, 600 feet per side for the operational model. The overall mission of the TR3B is logistics support and transportation for the Secret Space Command. If used on a planet or moon or large outpost, you would have a ready-made transportable space station. The TR3B carries a crew of 4 in the prototype version. The flight control system used on the TR3B consists of variable vectored intake and thrusters on the edges and advanced multi-mode propulsion engines on each tip of the triangle. 2 nuclear reactors serve as the power source for the magnetic field disruptor, also known as an MFD. The magnetic field disruptor utilizes a mercury liquid plasma, which is pressurized to 250,000 atmospheres and rotated at 50,000 RPM, resulting in a distortion or warpage of the localized gravity field by up to 89%. Therefore, G-forces are also reduced by 89%. So in effect, what he's saying is that this MFD interacts with how gravity interacts with mass. So you could be doing 1,000 miles an hour, make a left-hand turn 90 degrees, and you'd only feel 11% of the G's. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about anti-gravity per se, but a disruption of the gravity field. Materials used to construct the TR3B consisted of advanced composites, metamaterials, and titanium. 3 prototype TR3Bs were built. Cost per TR3B in $1990 was $1 billion per craft. Sightings by Edgar Fouché is 1975, high in the atmosphere at night at Edwards Air Force Base, 1976 within the southern part of the Nellis Range, and the late 1970s Groom Air Base. That's the one we want to focus on. TR3B utilizes telescopic landing gear legs with T-pads, operated by the National Reconnaissance Office, the National Security Agency, and the CIA. The craft exhibits a very low electromagnetic humming noise during operation. 1 light was located on each tip of the triangle. The craft incorporates electrochromic panels used for daytime stealth operations. So when you talk about electrochromic panels, what they're essentially doing is they're electronically transferring the image, what's in back of the craft, to the forward portion, essentially allowing it to blend in with the background, basically bringing it invisible. Vents on the side of the craft serve as variable vectored intake exhaust depending upon which direction the vehicle is going. So this is a drawing put together showing you these vents right here. This is the crew compartment and then the magnetic field disruptor right here. So then I asked Edgar Fouché, Edgar, instead of you just talking about the TR3B, can you give me an illustration of your sighting? This is what he came up with. This is Edgar Fouché's illustration of his sighting. This would have been 1979 at Area 51. This is avionics building number 9. the avionics laboratory at Area 51. Again, this is the longest runway right here. And he was going from the avionics laboratory to a blue blacked out windowed bus, Air Force bus. So it was about a 100-foot walk. And as he's walking to this bus, they had him wear these blacked out welder's goggles so he couldn't see anything around. Edgar Fouché is a pretty big guy, so when he looked down, there was a crack between the top portion of his forehead and the top portion of these welder's goggles, and he could see a crack of light. He looked outside that light and saw the TR-3B about 500 feet away. This is according to Edgar Fouché. So if you look at this runway diagram, you look at the buildings, remember these are the red hat hangars right here, we're talking at least 500 feet. And so that's how close he got to perhaps one of our classified flying triangles. Again, flying triangles, UFOs, the estimate of the situation, David Marler. This is by Richard Dolan Press, our good friend Richard Dolan. Anyone who's a skeptic regarding flying triangles, please look into this book and you'll see that there's quite a good historical background. I want to make a statement here. If you thought that all triangular UFO cases were the direct result of classified military aircraft, that would be incorrect. Now, how do we know this? Sightings of these triangular-shaped craft date back to 1890. Kelly Johnson, who formed the Skunk Works, he wasn't even born yet, so it couldn't be a Lockheed bird, right? It has to be something else. Now, when we talk about these liquid mercury plasma engines on the magnetic field disruptor associated with the TR-3B, that's the same thing we hear about on these Vimana aircraft that were 2,000 years before the time of Christ in the ancient Indian Sanskrit text. They talk about liquid mercury plasma engines with these Vimana type crafts. So this technology might date back much earlier than we thought. Is that the same technology that's used here in the Kecksburg Acorn that was recovered in Pennsylvania, December 9th, 1965? Is that the same technology used on the Nazi Bell, 1945? They had the same dimensions, the same configuration, the same bumper around the bottom circumference, the same strange hieroglyphic writing along the bottom. Both the Bell here, it also had these insulating bricks that were associated with test flights. Also, Joseph P. Farrell talked about how plants within the vicinity of test flights of the Bell turned to goo within 2 hours. Scientists who were near the Bell during operation died immediately. He also talks about how there's 2 counter-rotating drums that have a radioactive isotope of mercury called cerium-525. That may be some of the propulsion systems associated with the Bell. Now, by May of 1945, Adolf Hitler had 62 of the scientists associated with the Bell program murdered. These were brought up in the trials after Nazi criminal war crimes were brought to public, and so they talked about these 62 scientists being murdered associated with the Bell program. My question is, did SS General Hans Kammler, who was involved in the Bell program, did he cut a deal with the Americans? Did he have his record expunged of any crimes in exchange for technology? That's something we definitely want to keep in mind. Cash Landrum incident, Huffman, Texas, December 29th, 1980. This, by any other means, skeptics cannot debunk this case. This case had stood the test of time for so long now, and I invite anyone who's questioning the validity of some of these cases, please look at this case. You'll find that this has remained rock solid. 3 eyewitnesses, Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, Colby Landrum, were driving around 9 p.m., Huffman, Texas, when they noticed a bright light approaching their vehicle. It got brighter and brighter and brighter. It got so bright they became horrified. They were scared. It was traumatic. She even mentioned that she thought this was the second coming. She thought this is the end of the world. And what she saw was this twin double ice cream cone craft that was about 90 feet tall, had a series of light-colored blue portholes. We don't know if these were portholes, but they were circular outlets in this location here. It was about 30 feet above the pavement here. She slammed on her brakes. Betty Cash got out of the car, started going to the forward portion of the car to see this thing as a better look. And then it had these strange flames that were blue in color. that every time the flame came out, this craft would bob up, and then once the flame stopped, this craft would start slowly settling down again. This happened for about 2 minutes. At that point, Betty Cash was just about ready to get back into the vehicle. Now keep in mind, this is December 29th, 1980. It was cold outside. Just about the time she was getting ready to put her hand on that car door, she put her hand there and it burned the skin right off her hand. The whole exterior of the vehicle was becoming very hot. Once she got back inside the car, they had to turn the air conditioning on. It was so hot within this vehicle. This craft also emitted a beeping noise as this engine produced this thrust. And then about a minute after this departed, there were no less than 23 double-rotor Chinook CH-47s chasing after this craft with 2 UH-1 Hueys in chase with high-intensity light beams, like they were shepherding this vehicle, like they had foreknowledge of this particular flight. Now, it's my personal opinion that this was one of ours, ladies and gentlemen. Now, how can I back this up? If you look at this hearing before the Subcommittee on Research and Development, Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, this is the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Program, July 23rd, 1959. Once you start looking at this document, you start finding out how much the United States Air Force, the U.S. Navy, the Atomic Energy Commission spent on procurement funding on the NEPA program, the Nuclear Energy for Propulsion of Aircraft. Combined, they spent almost $1 billion by 1960. This is a schematic drawing of an atomic liquid-fueled rocket with subcritical reactor. So at least by 1960, they had the procurement funding, the engineering know-how to perhaps build such a craft. Here again, aircraft nuclear propulsion system, different cutaways within that diagram to back this up. So again, we have a legacy of technology, paperwork to back this up. I believe that this was a test flight of one of our original NEPA programs. It was an early NEPA program. There was a hull breach within that subcritical reactor that started spewing out fissionable material, and that's how Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum died from the effects of radiation poisoning regarding this. So it's important that we hold our government liable for essentially the murder of these two individuals. This case was actually never heard of in court. It was thrown out of court due to lack of evidence. Now, significant statements by Ben Rich regarding advanced aerospace propulsion systems and technology. Ben Rich, very interesting gentleman. I met with his son Michael Rich at the RAND Corporation. He was very nice, didn't reveal any secrets, but important to keep in mind, Ben took over the reins of the Skunk Works from Kelly Johnson in Burbank back in 1975. He headed the Skunk Works until 1991. And I want to really bring out some points here that I think are very important regarding what Ben Rich said about the technologies that we're talking about in this conference. Now, according to Ben Rich, and you can verify all these, they've been authenticated. I invite you to check this out yourself. We did the F-104, the C-130, the U-2, SR-71, F-117, and many other programs that I can't talk about. We are still working very hard. I just can't tell you what we're doing. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base slide presentation, September 26, 1992. Again, the Air Force has just given us a contract to take ET back home. We already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects. It would take an act of God to get them out to benefit humanity. There is an error in the equations. What equations is he talking about? There is an error in the equations, and we have figured it out and now know how to travel to the stars, and it won't take a lifetime to do it. So what equations is Ben Rich talking about here? It is time to end all secrecy on this, as it no longer poses a national security threat, and make the technology available for use in the private sector. It says we have some new things. We are not stagnating. What we are doing is updating ourselves without advertising. There are some new programs and certain things, some of them 20 or 30 years old, that are still breakthroughs and appropriate to keep quiet about. Other people don't have them yet. And then it says here, September 7th, 1988, AIAA lecture, so you can back that up too. I wish I could tell you about the projects we are currently working on. They are both fascinating and fantastic. They call for technologies once only dreamed of by science fiction writers, according to Ben Rich. What could that mean? Now, this is a new group that maybe some of you haven't heard of before. I got this from the Huntington Library from the papers of Ben R. Rich. The Skunk Works is always busy it's fortunate that we are able to turn out a breakthrough about every 10 years. The airplanes that we are building today, you won't hear about for another 10 years. Anything you can think of, we can do. And if not, maybe we have already done it. I cannot talk to you about anything we are doing today or have been doing probably for at least 5 or 10 years. If you saw the configurations I have on my desk today, they're mind-boggling, because if you can think of it, we can design it at the Skunk Works. So that's according to Ben Rich. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't think you're going to get a better group of comments regarding advanced aerospace propulsion systems. Now, John Andrews, who we mentioned before, was very good friends with Ben Rich. These two gentlemen, over decades, played this word Scrabble game where Ben Rich would kind of submit little hints to John, and that's how he was able to design the F-19 stealth model that turned out to be the highest selling plastic aircraft model of all history. Over 1 million units were sold. So John Andrews wrote a letter in 1986 to Ben Rich regarding his personal opinion of UFOs, even of crash retrievals. This is his original reply letter to John Andrews, dated July 8th, 1986. It says, "Dear John, in response to your letter of July 1st, I am a believer, and so is Kelly Johnson." So he's talking about UFOs, extraterrestrial technology. So if it's good enough for Kelly Johnson, to me, it's good enough for me. Now, here is the reply that John Andrews sent back to Ben Rich. He wanted to get some clarification. So Mr. Ben Rich, Lockheed Advanced Aeronautics Company, this is Burbank, California, 10 July 1986. "Dear Ben, a short note to clarify your interesting response regarding being a quote-unquote believer contained in your 8th July 1986 letter. The topic is UFO. I believe there are lots of UFOs. I am also tending to believe there are two types of UFOs or categories. A, man-made UFOs. B, extraterrestrial UFOs. I believe with certainty in man-made UFOs. I am tending to believe there are also extraterrestrial UFOs. Having the highest respect for both you and Kelly, I'd appreciate knowing your belief in both categories." So then Ben Rich sent back the letter. I was able to get the actual letter. Lockheed Company letterhead, July 21st, 1986. "Dear John," this is the response. "Yes, I'm a believer in both categories. I feel everything is possible. Many of our man-made UFOs were unfunded opportunities. In both categories, there are lots of kooks and charlatans. Be cautious, Ben Rich." So, the $64 billion question is, what did Ben Rich mean when he talked about unfunded opportunities, UFO? Was Ben Rich talking about programs that didn't get funded at the Skunk Works? Or, as some have suggested, which could be a possibility, was he talking about freebies or hand-me-downs that we got for others? Is that a possibility? It's certainly a possibility. But by 1995, Ben had passed away, so we don't know the answer to that question. Now, a good friend of mine, Jim Goodall, wrote a letter to Ben Rich, basically requesting a taped interview. Just go over a couple of quick points. "I would like to do a taped interview with you sometime in the near future." So obviously Jim knew that time was getting short for Ben. He wanted to get all this documented on videotape. It says, "We would cover everything that you have ever been involved in with your many years at Lockheed Skunk Works. We would cover all bases, leaving nothing out." He also said that he'd be glad to hold on to that tape for 10 years, 20 years, until he decided that it was appropriate to release into the public domain. Now, unfortunately, that interview never took place because, as we mentioned, Ben Rich passed away in 1995. But just prior to Ben's passing, Jim Goodall got one final telephone conversation into Ben Rich, who was dying at the hospital, and this is what Ben Rich told Jim Goodall over the phone just before he died. He says, "Jim, we have things in the Nevada desert that are 50 years beyond what you can comprehend. If you've seen it on Star Wars or Star Trek, we've been there, done that, or decided it wasn't worth the effort." So again, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think it's going to get any better than that. Talking about technologies that are 50 years beyond what we can comprehend from the Skunk Works. A couple of UFO cases that we should consider here. Hudson Valley Boomerang. Between 1982 and 1989, over 25,000 eyewitnesses reported a gigantic chevron or boomerang-shaped craft that hovered over cities north of New York City, about 20 minutes north of New York City. Primary eyewitnesses reported from air traffic controllers, doctors, policemen, law enforcement personnel. What they reported seeing is this boomerang-shaped craft with these tubes, pipes, and cylinders on the bottom of the vehicle. A very structured craft on the bottom. Also had multicolored flashing lights on the bottom as well. That's a very interesting thing to consider because it's been repeated over and over again. Now, March 24th, 1983, Taconic Stark Parkway, New York. This is on a Thursday. Multiple eyewitnesses saw a gigantic 300 feet per side flying boomerang-shaped craft with a triangle trailing edge hover over the Taconic State Parkway. People pulled over to the side of the road, slammed on their brakes, got out of their car, looked up and saw this craft. But then they said when they saw the bottom of it, it had these transparent panels so you could see inside the structure of the craft. And eyewitnesses reported seeing tubes, pipes, cylinders, steel girder, mechanical truss tube construction like a truss bridge. That's what they reported. So I want to ask everyone here, and you don't have to answer, does anyone here know what happened one day prior to this event? What happened on March 23rd, 1983? Reagan's speech, thank you. March 23rd, 1983 was Reagan's speech. He proposed the SDI program. So I asked the question, is there a connection between the Hudson Valley Boomerang and the SDI program by Ronald Reagan? Were they using these craft flying over large American cities as a nuclear deterrent, setting up an electromagnetic umbrella protecting us from incoming enemy Russian ICBMs? Is that a possibility? I'm just throwing it out there. Characteristics of the Hudson Valley Boomerang. Sightings of the craft came in from Connecticut, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. The craft was virtually silent and measured between 300 and 900 feet across. The UFO was seen hovering over busy expressways, lakes, and rivers. The object was reported by airline pilots, air traffic controllers, doctors, lawyers, local law enforcement, firemen, computer programmers. The craft appeared to have an industrial steel structural girder and crossbeam internal construction like a truss bridge. So what I've tried to do here is I've incorporated every conceivable configuration that was seen by the eyewitnesses. Again, we've got this tubes, pipes, and cylinders that was seen on the bottom of the vehicle, a triangle trailing edge, and then here we've got this section here showing you these transparent panels. Over here, I've shown you the original configuration of the B-2 stealth bomber. This is vintage 1983. Northrop spent $22.3 billion of our tax dollars designing this B-2 stealth bomber. 1983, they had absolutely nothing to show for our $22.3 billion. At the end of 1983, the Air Force and Northrop decided that they no longer wanted to have these low-altitude bombing platforms, and they changed the wing configuration to the double W that we see today. That cost all of us $1 billion for the wing redesign. Now, instead of me just talking about it just by myself, I wasn't there. I want to give you the eyewitness testimony directly from the people who saw this craft. This is Dennis Sant, very respectable gentleman. Here's his quote. This is Philadelphia Inquirer, September 28th, 1984. As it hovered, I could make out dark, smoky-colored metallic beams underneath, huge beams, according to Dennis Sant, March 17th, which was a Thursday when this actually took place. Again, Monique O'Driscoll, she sighted the object on March 17th, 1983, on a Thursday. This is her quote, and this is her painting that she made of this craft. I could see the underbelly part. It's solid. It had metal-type work, like cross beams and tubular things hanging down here and there. I was so close to it, I could have thrown a ball and hit it. That's from Monique O'Driscoll. This thing flew right over her head. Now, June 24th, 1984, Indian Point Nuclear Power Reactor. Something very significant happened on this particular night. I believe it may be one of the top 3 UFO cases of all history. According to no less than 12 Nuclear Regulatory Committee security guards, a gigantic 900-foot wide boomerang-shaped craft hovered over Reactor 3 for 20 minutes. So this is confirmed by 12 security guards, and this is a West Crum illustration of what this thing looked like. They had shotguns pointed at this thing. It shut down the security system of the nuclear power plant. It violated prohibited airspace. But then there was one of the security guards was in this remote hangar here. He had a camera, a remote camera, that was capturing all this on videotape. And in his words, quote, this craft was so large that he had to pan the camera 180 degrees across just to get the whole thing in the field of view. That's how big this craft was. That videotape was later confiscated by government officials, but there is a videotape of this particular event. Phoenix Lights, March 13th, 1997. Again, boomerang-shaped craft. It had a very small triangle trailing edge here, seen by thousands of eyewitnesses. Of course, the government tried to explain it away as flares, but I question how could flares start out north of Prescott, go down through prohibited airspace at Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix, and then continue down all the way to Tucson. Flares can't go that far. Eyewitnesses reported that the lights on this vehicle, they didn't look like just lights, but they were canister or studio lights that were embedded into the lower belly structure of the aircraft. Phoenix Lights, we've also want to cover the Belgium Triangle. This is November 29th, 1989. This is the newspaper clipping from the report talking about a gigantic 300-foot per side. Some eyewitnesses reported that this was over a football field inside. Also, we have the section here where the whole entire field section was lit up by the light that this craft emitted. A couple of quick reference points on this here from the Sun, July 23rd, 1991. We are under a sort of siege by high-tech flying machines. These craft are clearly the product of an advanced society and are under intelligent control. Their shape, size, speed, and the way they move are unlike anything known on Earth. These UFOs are technological marvels. They operate with a propulsion system unlike anything man has ever seen. Several eyewitnesses described the craft as big or bigger than an aircraft carrier or as big as a football field. One witness said that while the object was flying directly overhead, one could not see the front part and the end at the same time because it was too big. The craft had the capability of hovering and at times would suddenly accelerate so rapidly that it would be across the horizon in a second or two, and sometimes it would flash right back. In many cases, people saw structure underneath the craft, which included heavy metal parts, crisscross effects, diamond-shaped work, and tubular things here and there. So that's important to keep in mind. This was also tracked by two F-16s that got within 20 miles of this particular craft. It also released hundreds of small objects that were on the bottom of it. And then during this particular Belgian wave, flying squares, rectangles, platforms, and a manta ray-shaped craft were also seen by the eyewitnesses. So it wasn't just triangles that we were seeing here. Here is the illustration of this F-16 attempted intercept. This thing was going at about 250 knots, accelerating to about 1,800 knots within 2 seconds. That's equivalent to about 40 G's acceleration. Now, under normal circumstances, that would kill pilots, but if they're using another type of propulsion system, that may not be the case. Now, what are we talking about? Is this a man-made vehicle? We have the same tube, pipes, and cylinders configuration on the bottom of the Belgian Triangle that we looked at on the Hudson Valley Boomerang. Here's the radar track here from the onboard F-16 targeting radar. There were 3 independent ground radar tracking stations that also track this on radar. I want to bring your attention to a manta ray-shaped craft that was also seen December 1st, 1989. The movement of the lights was kind of like back and forth. And it looked very similar to the Knight Rider TV series in 1980s, Night Industries 2000. That's the movement of this light. It also looked like the Cylon Centurion helmets that were used in the 80s TV hit Battlestar Galactica. But the most important point I want to bring to your attention here, and this comes from Joseph Jones, who's another black aircraft researcher. He states that it was a joint program between Lockheed Skunk Works and British Aerospace. This is vintage 1984, 1985. They were developing something called Triangulum. That was the code name for this aircraft. And they were working on something called an EM drive. And this is part of a program called Brilliant Invader. That was the code name for this operation. So, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that this may be, in point of fact, the explanation for the Belgium Triangle Wave 1989-1990, which was the Brilliant Invader joint NATO training exercise. Knight Rider shows you the configuration of the lights in this location, also the Cylon Centurion helmet here. Now, what evidence do we have to back this up? Is it just Fairy tales, or do we have something to back this up? Jane's Defense Week, September 4th, 1996, has a very interesting article regarding the relationship between the UK and the US regarding stealth technology. The UK's relationship with the USA on stealth runs very deep, has been going on for many decades, and is extremely secret. Do we have anything else to back this up? It turns out that by the 1960s, they had accumulated so much information regarding what was done after World War II, when British intelligence was basically sucking up every shred of evidence recovered from the Nazis regarding radar cross-section development. That report was put in something called the Dawson Report, and then during an unknown date within the 60s, that report was brought over to Washington, D.C. and given to the defense contractors, probably Lockheed. So the other piece of evidence here is this very interesting book called I Could Tell You, but then You Would Have to Be Destroyed by Me by Trevor Paglen. Very interesting patch in this location right here. You'll note that the location of the beam of light is similar to the location of where the Belgium Triangle sightings actually took place. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope I've presented both sides of this case. I want to leave it to your discretion to decide who's who and what technology is actually being used. My point here is I'd like to see this technology handed over to the scientific community for the betterment of everyone on this planet, and I want to thank you for your attention. Excellent. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate that.